Good evening, everybody. It's great to see you this evening, and we thank you for being here for this time of Bible study. We're studying Old Testament characters in this Wednesday night class, just looking at some of the famous characters from the Old Testament and seeing what lessons we can learn from them, and there are plenty of lessons to learn, to be sure. I think it's a valuable form of Bible study when we look at character studies is how we would categorize this, and I think they're very helpful. Our lesson tonight, if you look at the study guide, we're on lesson 8. We're going to be talking about Samuel. So we've talked about a few of the judges. We certainly didn't cover all of the judges, but we talked about a few of the judges, and Samuel is the last of the judges of Israel leading up to the first king of Israel, of course, King Saul. So the story with Samuel starts out with information about his birth. And let's look in 1 Samuel chapter 1. Our author asks us what were Samuel's parents like, Hannah and Elkanah. In 1 Samuel chapter 1 at verse 3, this man Elkanah went up out of his city yearly to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of hosts in Shiloh. And the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, the priest of the Lord, were there. And so one of the things we would say about Samuel is that his parents seem to be certainly deeply religiously inclined. Verse 4, and when the time was that Elkanah offered, he gave to Peninnah, his wife, and to all her sons and her daughters portions. But unto Hannah he gave a worthy portion, for he loved Hannah, but the Lord had shut up her womb. And her adversary also provoked her sore, for to make her fret, because the Lord had shut up her womb. And so, this man Elkanah, the husband, who will be father of Samuel, he was a good man. He was kind to Hannah. You might think, well, he'll favor the other wife because the other wife has borne him these children, and Hannah hasn't borne him any children. Of course, that was so ultimately important in those times. But not so, and he was good and kind to Hannah. And so I think you would say that he comes from a parentage that is positive and good and inclined spiritually. Look in the next verses here, verse 9. Hannah rose up after they had eaten in Shiloh, so they went to make these sacrifices. After they had drunk, now Eli the priest sat upon a seat by the post of the temple of the Lord, and she was in bitterness of soul. Of course, it says temple. The King James says temple. This would still be tabernacle, right? The temple hasn't been built. She was in bitterness of soul and prayed unto the Lord and wept sore. And she vowed a vow and said, O Lord of hosts, if thou wilt indeed look on the affliction of thine handmaid and remember me, and not forget thine handmaid, but will give unto thine handmaid a man-child, then I will give him unto the Lord all the days of his life, and there shall no razor come upon his head. And so another thing that we would say about the parents of Samuel, here's his mother. She was devoted to prayer. She was devoted to God. And so all of that seems to be very positive in regards to Samuel. Now, she makes this promise that if she would have a child, she would give the child to the Lord all the days of his life. And so she makes a promise. We would even probably refer to that as a vow that would need to be kept. Now, under the Old Testament law, a husband had the right to rescind a vow that his wife had made. If his wife made a vow, he could either affirm it or he could reject it. But in this case, notice in verse 20, it came to pass when the time was come about after Hannah had conceived that she bare a son, called his name Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. And the man Elkanah and all his house went up to offer to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and his vow. But Hannah went not up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child be weaned, and then I will bring him, that he may appear before the Lord and there abide forever. And Elkanah her husband said to her, do what seemeth to thee good, tarry until thou have weaned him. Only the Lord established his word. So the woman abode and gave her son suck until she weaned him. Look at Numbers 30, verse 8. And that might be a good verse to write in your margin, because we'll see there that the husband has the right to reject a vow made by his wife. Numbers 30, verse 8. But if her husband disallowed her on the day that he heard it, then he shall make her vow which she vowed, and that which she uttered with her lips, wherewith she bound her soul, of none effect, and the Lord shall forgive her. And so at that juncture, Elkanah, the husband, could have said, hey, I'm not doing that. There's no way I'm doing that. But he respected Hannah, he respected the vow she made. He affirmed it and agreed that this would be what takes place. I don't know about you, but when you stop to think about that, don't you think that would have been a really hard thing to follow through on? I mean, she was in anguish of soul, so she made a promise. She made a vow. Well, the Lord answered her prayer and she received a child. How easy that would have been to say, oh, well, I kind of spoke rashly there. I made a promise, but boy, it's just going to be too hard to keep the promise. I'm not going to do that. I'm just not going to do that. I think it'll be okay. God will probably forgive me for that, but I'm not following through for that. Here's a woman who'd wanted a child for so long and finally got one. I think it would have been easy to try and back out of that promise that you'd made, but she did not. Of course, it speaks to her worthy character for sure. But I think there's a principle there that we could even apply in our time. Because we don't make vows of that sort today, but we do make commitments, and I think you could use the word promises to God. For instance, I've tried to encourage some people when they obey the gospel to view it as a promise or a commitment to God. When you say that you want to be baptized into Christ, become a Christian, you're actually making a promise. You're committing yourself. How in our story tonight, how would it have seemed of Hannah if she had backed out of what she promised to do? We'd say, man, that's bad. That's real bad. That was very bad on her part to back out after having made such a promise as that. How do you think it looks on our part if we vow and commit to ourselves to the Lord in obeying the gospel and seeking His blessings of forgiveness? How does it look on us if we don't follow through? I've tried to make the point before. I can remember making it to some folks who had just recently obeyed the gospel and said, now remember, you promised to God that you would serve Him from now on the rest of your life. I'll tell you, I don't like it when people make me promises and they don't keep it. God doesn't like it when people make promises to Him and don't keep it either. You don't want to get on God's bad side. You're making a commitment here. You're going to have to live up to it. I really think that's a good way to look at it. Any thoughts or comments on that? Anybody? Monty.
When we don't keep our vows or our commitments, basically when it boils down to is we've lied. We've told a lie. And the scriptures are clear. It says all liars shall have their part in the lake of fire. And so when we do that, then we're condemning ourselves to hell when we don't keep our commitments. Whether it's our commitment to God to be a faithful servant to Him, or whether I make a commitment to you for whatever, or I make a commitment to the bank, they loan me money to buy a house, and if I don't pay the money back, whatever it is, we've made a commitment. And we don't honor that and keep that commitment, then we've lied and we've qualified ourselves for eternal punishment.
Okay, I think that's right.
Yes, in Psalms 15, it's about a citizen of Zion. He swears to his own hurt.
Yeah.
He does not change.
And so the one who swears to his own hurt, he swore to it. Now if he follows through, it's going to hurt him, but he keeps it anyway, even when it's not what he wants to do. That's right. Good point. Karen?
I was thinking of the same word that Monty was thinking of about commitment. We have commitments in our lives, not just our most important commitment to God, but to a spouse, to an employer, as you said, like a bank loan. We commit, and we're supposed to follow through with this. And I believe God takes all such commitments very seriously.
Yeah.
Hates divorce. It's just something very important that we shouldn't do rashly.
I think you're exactly right. The whole story, the whole rest of this story about Samuel wouldn't have been a story if Hannah hadn't kept her vow and promise that she made about the child. And so she does give him over, and Eli is the current judge and priest, and his sons are wicked. The author asks, what kind of influence would Eli's sons have had on a young Samuel? Well, potentially their influence could have been very bad. In chapter 2, 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 12, now the sons of Eli were sons of Belial. They knew not the Lord. And the priest's custom with the people was that when any man offered sacrifice, the priest's servant came while the flesh was in seething, and a flesh hook of 3 teeth in his hand, and he struck it into the pan or kettle or cauldron or pot. All that the flesh hook brought up, the priest took for himself. So they did in Shiloh unto all the Israelites that came thither. Also, before they burnt the fat, the priest's servant came and said to the man that sacrificed, give flesh to roast for the priest, for he will not have sodden flesh of thee, but raw. If any man said unto him, let them not fail to burn the fat presently, and then take as much as thy soul desireth, then he would answer him, nay, but thou shalt give it me now, and if not, I will take it by force. Wherefore the sin of the young men was very great before the Lord, for men abhorred the offering of the Lord. So Hophni and Phinehas were bad guys, really bad guys. And we know the story. We've studied before about Eli. God was going to judge Eli because Eli knew of their wickedness. And it says he restrained them not. He was aware of their evil, and he hadn't taken any steps to stop them. He verbally complained about it, but he didn't stop them from their evil practices. And so here's Samuel. He's in that environment. Verse 18, the next verse says, but Samuel ministered before the Lord, being a child, girded with a linen ephod. Moreover, his mother made him a little coat and brought it to him from year to year when she came up with her husband to offer the yearly sacrifice. And so there's the potential that Samuel could have been badly influenced by that. Personally, he was not. However, I do wonder, when we read later in the life of Samuel, his sons turned out to be bad guys too. And you have to wonder if maybe he saw a bad, in other words, his natural father was Elkanah, but the one who effectively raised him was Eli. And he saw Eli fail as a father, and he followed some of that same pattern with his own sons. I don't know. It filters down that way, doesn't it? And so we might learn the lesson as parents. If we do a bad job, our kids are going to learn from us. Our kids are going to learn how to be parents by watching us be parents. And if we're bad parents, they may learn to also be bad parents. That's something to think about. Monty?
Often thought when we think about Eli and his sons, and later David and Solomon wind up falling away, and some other David's sons like Absalom wasn't good at all. I think sometimes people, maybe in their efforts to be in charge or ruling or whatever over other people, are so involved with their work with other people that they neglect their families.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe what it's showing is that you've got to have a balance in that. Yes, as Christians, we've got to be working with other people to bring them to Christ. But we've got a responsibility to our families to do the same thing. And so we don't need to neglect one in favor of the other. We've got to have a proper balance. And I think that's something I see in a lot of these people's lives, is like Eli. And a lot of times you see people that overlook things in their own family that they wouldn't overlook in somewhere else. And, Eli's overlooked this bad trait in his sons. And yet he complained about it, you shouldn't be doing that. But as high priest, for one thing, he talked about them committing fornication for women that came to the temple. That was a capital offense. He could have had them put to death. He could have stopped this and been pleasing to God. But because he wasn't, God's going to curse him.
Exactly
and his
right.
family forever.
Exactly right. So, all this business about Eli being such a terrible parent, and it falls upon Samuel to be the one who breaks the news to him about God's impending punishment. So pick this up in chapter 3. In chapter 3, verse 4, the Lord called Samuel, and he answered, here am I. And he ran unto Eli and said, Here am I, for thou callest me. And he said, I called not, lie down again. And he went and lay down. So in the night, in the middle of the night, the Lord calls out to Samuel. Samuel thinks it's Eli calling him. And he obviously a very obedient child, he runs to Eli. What do you need from me? Well, Eli said, it wasn't me. Go lie down. And I believe that happens 3 times. And finally, verse 8, the Lord called Samuel again the 3rd time, and he arose and went to Eli and said, Here am I, for thou didst call me. And Eli perceived that the Lord had called the child. Therefore Eli said unto Samuel, Go lie down, and it shall be, if he call thee, that thou shalt say, Speak, Lord, for thy servant heareth. So Samuel went and lay down in his place, and the Lord came and stood and called as at the other times, and Samuel, Samuel. Then Samuel answered, Speak, for thy servant heareth. So here's what's going to happen. So God's going to use Samuel, who's still, notice, just a child, still a child. He's going to use him to deliver this very hard message. Look at verse 11. The Lord said to Samuel, Behold, I will do a thing in Israel at which both the ears of every one that heareth it shall tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all things that I have spoken concerning his house. When I begin, I will also make an end. For I have told him that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knoweth, because his sons made themselves vile, and he restrained them not. And therefore I have sworn unto the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be purged with sacrifice or offering forever. And Samuel lay down until the morning and opened the doors of the house of the Lord. And Samuel feared to show Eli the vision. Then Eli called Samuel and said, Samuel, my son. And he answered, Here am I. And he said, What is the thing that the Lord has said unto thee? I pray thee, hide it not from me. God do so to thee, and more also, if thou hide anything from me of things that he has said unto thee. And Samuel told him every whit, and hid nothing from him. And he said, It is the Lord. Let him do what seemeth good to him. And so, again, I'm just very impressed that as just a child, he was called upon to make this very hard delivery of a condemning message. Again, I don't want to overstrain at a point, but sometimes we have hard things that need to be said to certain people. And we often try to dodge that responsibility. We often try to get out of that. We know that there's a certain someone that needs to be rebuked because they're not living right. And we're aware of it, and we know we should say something, but we postpone and procrastinate and put it off, and maybe ultimately never get around to saying to them what should have been said to them, because it's just uncomfortable for us to do so. We could learn from the child Samuel. This would not have been an easy thing to do, and yet he was faithful to carry it out. And I think just in that in itself stands as a worthy example for us. Anybody? Any thoughts on that? All right. So we skip ahead in our study guide to chapter 7. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, verse 3, Samuel spake unto all the house of Israel, saying, If ye do return unto the Lord with all your hearts, then put away the strange gods and the Ashtaroth from among you, and prepare your hearts unto the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. Okay, so obviously what's happened between our two sort of points in the story, Eli has now died. Remember his sons. What happened? There was a battle with the Philistines, and his sons were killed, and the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines. And when Eli remember Eli was sitting at the gate, sitting on a stone at the gate of the city, and when the news of that arrived, he fell backwards and died, and so broke his neck, I guess, and died. As a result of hearing the bad news of what had happened. So now we're moving forward in time, and Samuel is now the judge, and he's calling upon the Israelites to repent and if they will, that God will deliver them from the hand of the Philistines. But notice the emphasis is on, you got to repent, you got to turn to the Lord, you got to put away the evil things that you've been doing. You got to stop worshiping the idolatrous gods of the people. And under his leadership, verse 4 says, the children of Israel did put away Balaam and Ashtaroth and served the Lord only. So the children of Israel are able to throw off the oppression of the Philistines, consequent to that. And so, subsequent to the victory over the Philistines, look at verse 12. Samuel took a stone and set it between Mizpah and Shin and called the name of it Ebenezer, saying, hitherto hath the Lord helped us. So, here's a word. This is just an interesting word to know the meaning of, because we never use it. We never hear of it except in a religious connotation. But we have a song even that mentions, here I raise my Ebenezer. Well, what in the world does that mean anyway? Here I raise my Ebenezer. Well, it comes from this. And so Samuel set up sort of a stone monument. And actually the verse explains the meaning of it. Hitherto hath the Lord helped us, or the Lord has helped us thus far, or with God's help we have come to this place. That's sort of the meaning of Ebenezer. And so that's just something good to keep in mind whenever we occasionally sing that song that contains that phrase, here I raise my Ebenezer. It just means here I am willing to say I've come thus far because God has helped me. And I'm giving him the glory and the honor. Samuel is almost like we would refer to as a circuit riding preacher. Skip down to verse 16 there. He went from year to year in circuit to Bethel and Gilgal and Mizpah and judged Israel in all those places. And his return was to Ramah, for there was his house. And there he judged Israel, and there he built an altar to the Lord. I don't know whether, now I don't know this, but it kind of makes me wonder. It's not terminology we use too much in our time, but in generations past, we would refer to circuit riding preachers that would do a kind of traverse a circuit, preaching one Sunday here and one Sunday in the next place, a circuit riding preacher. And I wonder if it comes from that terminology in the King James Version there at the end of 1 Samuel 7. All right. In chapter 8, our author asks us, how did Israel repay him and God for the good things that had been happening to them? In other words, they had overthrown their oppressors. They're out from the oppression of the Philistines. Things are going well. But in chapter 8, verse 3, oh, wait a minute. Here's that business about his sons, right? His sons walked not in his ways, but turned aside after lucre and took bribes and perverted judgment. Then all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah and said to him, behold, thou art old, and thy sons walk not in thy ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the nations. And so, again, that's that reference we talked about earlier, that Samuel's own sons turned out to be bad guys. We talked briefly about how some of Eli's influences might have rubbed off on Samuel as a father. But the people say, your sons are not good. They don't walk in your ways. But the emphasis has always been placed on, we want a king like all the nations around us. We want to be like the nations around us. That's a bad desire. That's an evil motivation on their part. Want to be like the nation. What about the nations around us? Well, the nations around them were wicked, idolatrous heathens. And they were the people of God. And God was their immediate leader. But they want to be like the nations. Verse 6, keep reading there, verse 6. the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed unto the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, hearken to the voice of the people and all that they say unto thee. For they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, and that I should not reign over them, according to all the works which they have done since the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, wherewith they have forsaken me and served other gods, so do they also unto thee. Now therefore hearken unto their voice, howbeit yet protest solemnly unto them, and show them the manner of the king that shall reign over them. Samuel's really personally offended by this request of the Israelites. It displeases him. I don't know whether it displeased him because he took it as a personal disloyalty so much as he saw it as an insult to God. I would argue more the latter, that he's not upset for himself. He's upset for the fact that the people are really making a statement against God's direct leadership over the nation of Israel. And so God says, yeah, go. They haven't done this. They haven't rejected you, but they've rejected me, is what God told Samuel. So Samuel goes on to sort of describe, how's this going to, I want to tell you right up front how this is going to turn out for you. And I really don't think that he's giving an inspired prophetic description of what he just knows how it turns out with kings. Here's what your kings will do. Verse 11. This will be the manner of the king who shall reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them for himself, for his chariots, and to be his horsemen. Some shall run before his chariots. And he will appoint him captains over thousands and captains over 50s. And he will set them to ear his ground and to reap his harvest and to make his instruments of war and instruments of his chariots. And he will take your daughters to be confectionaries and to be cooks and to be bakers. And he will take your fields and your vineyards and your olive yards, even the best of them, and give them to his servants. And he will take the tenth of your seed and of your vineyard and give to his officers and to his servants. And he will take your men servants and your maid servants and your goodliest young men and your asses and put them to his work. He will take the tenth of your sheep, and ye shall be his servants. And ye shall cry out in that day because of your king which ye have chosen you. And the Lord will not hear you in that day. So again, I don't think that I don't think that little statement there that Samuel makes I don't think he was being prophetic as much as he was just saying, this is what kings do. And if you choose to have a king, you're going to ultimately regret that you chose to do that, because of all, they're going to take. Basically, we would say they're going to tax you heavily before all is said and done. And they actually did that, didn't they? I kind of think of the fulfillment of that being when, after Solomon died, and the people came to Rehoboam, his son, and said, your father was wearing us out with taxes, and we'd like you to lighten the load. And Rehoboam unwisely rejected their request and said, I'm going to make it worse. And then he lost the 10 northern tribes, and the nation split. But I think Samuel's indications here came true. But I think anybody could have said, it will come true, because that's what kings do. Sarah?
Moses had actually told them that this would happen.
Yeah.
And they would ask for a king in Deuteronomy 17, verses 14 through 16 or 17. But he told them, I will set a king over you. You will say, I will set a king over you like all the nations that are around me. You will surely set a king over you whom the Lord your God chooses. So some of what Samuel was saying was from his knowledge.
Now that was prophetic, what Moses said, right? I'm just saying, in this context, I don't think the description Samuel says of what the king will ultimately do. I just think that's just, so he's just saying, you'll be sorry before it's all said and done. You'll be sorry that you made this choice, because your king is going to really lay heavy burdens on you. But as you say, Moses was inspired to prophesy that they would want a king and get one. I think you're right. All right. Let's skip to chapter 12. I'm looking at question number 11. It says, what do we learn of Samuel's character from this passage? Chapter 12, beginning verse 1. Samuel said unto all Israel, behold, I have hearkened unto your voice and all that ye said to me, and have made a king over you. And now behold, the king walketh before you, and I am old and gray-headed, and behold, my sons are with you, and I have walked before you from my childhood until this day. Behold, here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken, or whose ass have I taken, or whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Or of whose hand have I received any bribe to blind mine eyes therewith? And I will restore it you. And they said, Thou hast not defrauded us, nor oppressed us, neither hast thou taken aught of any man's hand. And he said to them, The Lord is witness against you, and his anointed is witness this day, that ye have not found aught in my hand. And they answered, He is witness. So obviously just before this, Saul is appointed the king over Israel, the first king over Israel. But Samuel puts a challenge before the people that I think a lot of people would be really hesitant to do. Come on, if I've done anything at all wrong, you're welcome to just tell me. Just come right on out, just blurt it out, and I'll make it right. If I've wronged any of you in any way, just say so. I mean, I believe that he could make that challenge with the confidence that he had lived righteously in the role that he performed, as he mentions there, even from his childhood, he had served the Lord and done so faithfully. Really, I would think that probably the only negative that you would ring up against Samuel is the matter of his sons. He had not raised his sons effectively. But beyond that, I don't know how many people, I don't know how many of us would be willing to just throw open that, okay, if you know anything, if you know any one thing that I've ever done that I shouldn't have done, say so right now. I don't know how many of us would want to open that challenge up. Monty?
He does this after the king has been appointed. And so what he's saying, all right, there's an authority figure now. If you don't like the way I've been doing things, you can get your justice here. Tell your king about it. And if I've defrauded you, he can take care of it. And so it's not just that he's thrown it out there and said it, which he was confident in what he said. But he said, all right, you've got what you wanted. Here's a king to take care of your business for you. Throw the business out there if I've done something wrong.
I think right. So, based upon, and no accuser steps forward, as you notice, no accuser steps forward and say, I'll tell you what you did, Samuel, and this was really bad on your part, and I wish you'd make it. Nobody came forward with any such accusation against him. So I think just on the basis of that analysis, I think you'd have to say that Samuel was really a great man. I mean, but as with all great men, he had the chinks in his armor. In his case, his sons were the sort of the bad mark on his permanent record. But beyond that, he's a good man, and he really served the Lord faithfully, and served the nation of Israel faithfully as well. So he's obviously in a diminishing role now. They've got a king. They don't need a judge anymore. They've got a king. But Samuel suggests that he still feels a burden for them. In verse 23, chapter 12, verse 23, Moreover, as for me, God forbid that I should sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you, but I will teach you the good and the right way. And so it would have been easy perhaps to be bitter, to be resentful for how this had turned out, and feel like that they had personally rejected him. But he said, no. He said, I will not cease to pray for you. He said, I will not sin against the Lord in ceasing to pray for you. So he's going to continue to pray and teach, and we think that he did. All right. In chapter 13, there's an episode here in chapter 13 that already begins the downfall of King Saul. This is really interesting to me. If you go back to chapter 10, in chapter 10, when Samuel anoints Saul to be king, he said, he took verse 1, he took a vial of oil, poured it upon his head, kissed him, and said, It is not because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain. Is it not, because the Lord hath anointed thee to be captain over his inheritance. So he's anointing Saul king. And he gives him some things that are going to happen. He said, verse 2, when thou art departed from me today, thou shalt find 2 men by Rachel's sepulchre in the border of Benjamin at Zelzah. And they will say to thee, the asses which thou wentest to seek are found, and lo, thy father hath left the care of the asses and sorroweth for you, saying, what shall I do for my son? Remember, Saul had been sent by his father to find some donkeys that had wandered off. So he says, when you leave here, these 2 men, you're going to meet 2 men, and they're going to tell you, the donkeys have been found, and now your father's worried about you. What's happened to you? Verse 3, then thou shalt go forward from thence, and thou shalt come to the plain of Tabor, and there thou wilt meet 3 men going up to God to Bethel, one carrying 3 kids, another carrying 3 loaves of bread, another carrying a bottle of wine. And they shall salute thee, and give thee 2 loaves of bread, which thou shalt receive out of their hand. After that thou shalt come to the hill of God, where is the garrison of the Philistines, and it shall come to pass, when thou art come thither to the city, that thou shalt meet a company of prophets coming down from the high place with a psaltery, with tabret, and pipe, and a harp before them, and they shall prophesy, and the Spirit of the Lord will come upon thee, and thou shalt prophesy with them, and shalt be turned into another man. And let it be when these signs are come to thee, that thou do as occasion serve thee, for God is with thee. And thou shalt go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down to thee to offer burnt offerings and to sacrifice sacrifices of peace offerings. 7 days shalt thou tarry till I come to thee and show thee what thou shalt do. So, he said, all these signs are going to happen. I believe that these signs were, that Samuel prophesied these signs, and they came to pass to confirm to Saul, you are the chosen king that God wants. But notice verse 8. Go to Gilgal, you go down to Gilgal, wait for me 7 days, and I'll come down there and offer sacrifices. Well, that's what we find in chapter 13. In chapter 13 at verse 7, Saul, it says, as for Saul, he was yet in Gilgal. All the people followed him trembling. He tarried 7 days according to the set time that Samuel had appointed. But Samuel came not to Gilgal, and the people were scattered from him. In other words, he's about to engage the Philistines in battle, is what the story is. And so verse 9, Saul said, bring hither a burnt offering to me and peace offerings. And he offered the burnt offering. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of offering the burnt offering, behold, Samuel came. And Saul went out to meet him, that he might salute him. And Samuel said, what hast thou done? And Saul said, because I saw that the people were scattered from me, and that thou camest not within the days appointed, that the Philistines gathered themselves together at Michmash, therefore said I, the Philistines will come down now upon me to Gilgal, and I have not made supplication to the Lord. I forced myself, therefore, and offered a burnt offering. And Samuel said to him, thou hast done foolishly. Thou hast not kept the commandment of the Lord thy God, which he commanded thee. For now the Lord would have established thy kingdom upon Israel forever, but now thy kingdom shall not continue. We're going to look at chapter 15 in just a minute. In chapter 15, we remember the famous episode about the Amalekites, King Saul and the Amalekites. But even before that, in this instance, Samuel had already indicated, you're not going to establish a dynasty over Israel. Your descendants are not going to reign over Israel. And he points this to be the first reason why. Because Samuel was really a great excuser. I forced myself to make sacrifices. He wasn't qualified to make sacrifices. But he said, I forced myself to do it because you didn't come. Well, if he had waited just an hour or so, Samuel would have been there on the appointed day. But he said, I forced myself to do this. I had to do it because of the circumstances. That excuse didn't work, of course. Then, skipping down to chapter 15, we know very well 1 Samuel 15 is the story of Saul and the Amalekites. Verse 1, Samuel said to Saul, the Lord has sent me to anoint thee to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken unto the voice of the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel, how he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek, and utterly destroy all that they have, and spare them not. Slay both man and child, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. And Saul gathered the people together, and then he went to battle. So we talked about this not so very long ago, but remember the instruction to utterly destroy the Amalekites was a punishment that God had indicated was going to take place. Remember when the children of Israel first coming out of Egypt, the Amalekites attacked them, but they didn't. They did it in a cowardly way. They attacked from the back, and they were cutting down the stragglers, the weak, the sick, the elderly at the rear ranks of the Israelites. And remember that? I think we talked about that when we talked about Joshua, how that Joshua led the children of Israel into that battle. Moses, as long as he held his hands up, they prevailed. When his arms got tired and he let his arms down, then the Amalekites prevailed. And so they actually held Moses' hands up. Aaron and Hur held up Moses' hands, and Joshua prevailed. But it was in that battle, and at the end of that battle, when the Lord indicated there's a time coming when the Amalekites are going to pay for what they did, and this is that time. And so he commissions Saul to go and utterly destroy the Amalekites, and Samuel is the one who delivers that message. Go do this. The Lord wants this done. Well, of course, what happens when we skip down to verse 13, Samuel went out to meet Saul. Verse 13, Saul came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed be thou, the Lord." Saul said to Samuel, "Blessed be thou, the Lord, I have performed the commandment of the Lord." And Samuel said, "What meaneth then this bleating of the sheep in my ears and the lowing of the oxen which I hear?" You say you did what you were told to do. How come I'm hearing these animals? Because your instruction was to utterly destroy the Amalekites and everything they possessed and take no spoil. And I'm hearing these animals. What's this about? Saul, the great excuse maker, says, verse 15, "They have brought them from the Amalekites, for the people spared the best of the sheep and of the oxen to sacrifice unto the Lord thy God, and the rest we have utterly destroyed." So Saul's excuse is, well, the people, actually, it wasn't me, and it wasn't really what I wanted, but the people kept the best of the spoil because the intention was that we'd have this huge big sacrifice ceremony. It's going to be grand. We're going to have the best big old sacrifice service you ever saw anywhere. And then that, of course, provokes Samuel's famous quote, verse 22. Samuel said, "Hath the Lord his great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, to hearken than the fat of the rams. For rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and stubbornness is as iniquity and idolatry. Because thou hast rejected the word of the Lord, he hath also rejected thee from being king." And so here again, I think it's kind of interesting that on several occasions, it has been Samuel's job to deliver a harsh message of rebuke. I mean, he did it early on with Eli. He rebuked the children of Israel when they cried out, "We want a king like the nations around us." Here he issues a very stern rebuke against King Saul for this business with the Amalekites. Again, I think that overall, you put Samuel down as a really great servant of God and a noble character, a good man. He had the particular weakness with his own sons, but beyond that, I don't think that there's anything negative that you would really say about him. And so I think he stands out as a good character to learn from. And maybe I think the greatest lesson that I would take away from his example is do what has to be done even when it's hard to do it. Say what has to be said even when it's tough, and you'd rather not have to. And I think we see that in Samuel. Any thoughts or comments? Anybody? All right. Next week, Lord willing, we'll do the great prophet Elijah next week. Thanks, everybody.